The trouble was, Robin thought, his plan had succeeded too well. There was chaos in the castle, and it was as likely to trap him as save him. "Thank you," Kate gasped as he pulled her along behind him. "Don't thank me yet," he told her, as the first soldier loomed in front of them. His eyes glared from beneath his helmet, but when he moved to draw his sword, the press of people trapped his arm. The soldier growled as he tried to shake them off, and Robin lunged forward, butting the man's nose with his forehead. The soldier yelled, dropping his sword as his hands fumbled for his face. Robin kicked the blade out of reach, and Kate lifted the chain between her hands and swung it against the soldier's head. He let out one final groan and crashed to the ground. They ran on. But now the sheriff's men knew where they were. It all depended on the gang. They should have been watching and waiting. They were supposed to drop him a ladder to scale the walls, but as he scanned the stones with frantic eyes, he could see no sign of it. The stones of the outer baileys stretched up, smooth and unassailable. At the very top, 3 distant faces stared down at him, Much, Little John, and Alan. "Master!" He just about heard Much shout desperately. He could see the problem now. The ladder had caught on a metal sconce 20 paces above him. John was shaking it, trying to free the rope. Robin snatched a look behind him and saw that the soldiers were closing in fast. An arrow thunked into the wall close to his head, and he flinched away from the shards of flint. "Hurry up!" he shouted to Much, who, far above, could only shrug helplessly. Another arrow thudded into the wall beside him, and then another, and this time it took a sliver of his flesh as it passed. Kate cried out, and he knew that she'd been hit too. Above them, the rope ladder jiggled and rocked, but didn't fall. Then another arrow shot by a hand's width from Kate's cheek, and he knew they were out of time. He drew his own bow as he turned again to face their attackers. The nearest was only 30 paces away, pushing his way through the crowd. The soldier didn't even slow, advancing and knocking another arrow. Robin primed his own bow, hesitating only when he was at full stretch, the tip of his arrow quivering with tension. Could he do it? Risk others to save Kate? "Don't shoot!" Kate said, grabbing his arm. Robin cursed and twisted away, releasing the arrow to clatter harmlessly into the cobbles. Kate shrugged. "You've got a sword, haven't you?" He opened his mouth to tell her that swords weren't much use if you were outnumbered 50 to 1. But his words were drowned out by a terrible, inhuman cry. The noise was so loud it halted everyone in their tracks for a moment. The villagers and the soldiers froze in a tableau of conflict like one of the grander tapestries in the sheriff's hall. Of course! It was the drayman's horse, the one that had drawn the cart carrying the logs for the fire. Trapped in the courtyard with an angry mob, the animal was half mad with terror. Robin was moving before he consciously realized what he intended. Kate shot him a quick, surprised look and then raced after him. Robin shouldered villagers out of his way, old and young, and hoped that he'd pushed them far enough to be safe from the advancing soldiers. He couldn't see the horse anymore, but he could still hear it. Its neigh was almost a scream, and he thought only the crush of people stopped it bolting. Much longer and it might try anyway, trampling anyone in its path beneath its hooves. Robin put on a last burst of speed, Kate sprinting beside him, fair hair flying behind her, and then the horse was right in front of him. Flecks of spittle flew from its black lips as it drew them back in a snarl. For the first time, Robin faltered. "What's the problem?" Kate gasped. "It's," Robin said, and wondered how to finish the sentence. "Huge? Demented? Terrifying?" It hasn't got a saddle," he finished instead. "Oh, for..." Kate said. With a fearlessness that made his breath catch, she approached the animal, holding out the flat of her hand. It snorted, and for a moment Robin thought it was going to bite her. Then it dipped its head and gently rested its lips against her palm. She smiled widely, and suddenly Robin could see how beautiful she was. He felt a stab of guilt for noticing it. How could he look at any other woman, now Marion was gone? Then he heard shouts behind him and the telltale metallic scrape of a sword being drawn. Kate heard it too. Her eyes widened as she looked over his shoulder. Then her hand shifted from the horse's muzzle to its mane, and in a move so fluid it looked almost effortless, she pulled herself up onto the creature's back. Knees clasped around its withers, she reached an arm down to Robin. "Hurry!" she said. "They're right behind you!" His own scramble onto the animal's back was far less elegant. He seemed suddenly to have too many legs and not enough hands, and the horse stuck against him, bucking and rearing as he tried to mount. "Come on!" Kate yelled. And with a final heave that nearly dislocated his shoulder, he was on. She didn't wait for him to secure himself before she kicked the horse into motion. Startled, he jolted back, sliding down its flanks and nearly off. At the last minute, he made a desperate grab for her waist, managing to hook his fingertips into the flimsy material of her dress. And then he realized that his bow still hung at his back, and he was clear above the crowd. If he used it now, he'd hit exactly what he intended. The wood of the bow felt warm and comfortable in his hand, slicked, smooth from all the times he'd held it just like this. His shoulder ached when he drew it back, but he didn't mind. The weapon felt like part of him, the simplest part, the part that had no doubts. His first arrow struck the nearest soldier's sword, knocking it from his hand to clatter on the cobbles below. The next found a bow, slicing neatly through the string. The wood sprung apart, catching that soldier under the chin and knocking him to the ground. 3 more arrows, hitting 2 more swords and another bow, and then they were nearly at the wall. Only one figure stood between them and escape. It was Gisborne. Of course. The plague and bane of Robin's life. For a second, the men's eyes locked. Robin felt his rage rise, and he could see it in the other man's face, in the red flush of his pallid cheeks. He lifted his bow, an arrow already trembling for release. Gisborne's sword swung out and round, but Robin knew he'd be too late. The fatal strike would be his. Marion would be avenged. And then the horse reared and lashed out, its hoof catching Gisborne a cruel blow across the side of his head. His body slumped to the ground and the horse leapt over him. Robin didn't know if it had trampled him as they landed, but he didn't have time to care. The castle wall finally lay right in front of them, their only chance of escape. The ladder was there, still caught on the metal sconce. It was nearer now, but not near enough, still 10 feet up and out of reach. The horse grunted in protest as Robin rose to his feet on his back. He felt the muscles of its flank bunch, and he knew that any second now it would buck to dislodge him. Kate grunted in protest too as he pulled her up, flinging her over his back like a sack of grain. He shifted on his toes, poised, and when the horse's hoofs left the ground, he flung himself upwards, using the force of its jump to propel him. His hand hooked onto the bottom rung of the ladder, slipped, and then desperately grasped. His torn shoulder shrieked in protest, but he ignored it. One final heave, and then his other hand grasped hold too. Kate hung from his back, legs tangling with his own. The weight of her was almost too much for him to bear, but then Robin felt her scramble up and over him until she could get her own grip on the wooden rungs. And then they were both climbing up, and though one final arrow thudded into the stones below them, it was too late. They'd made it. They were free.